He was a billionaire, but in that moment he would have given up his entire fortune for one miracle: his daughter, once full of life, now trapped in silence, unable to move, unable to walk, paralyzed. Doctors gave up, specialists failed, hope vanished, until one rainy morning, a barefoot boy stepped out from the shadows. No name tag, no white coat, no reputation, just a whisper: "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." And in that moment, the billionaire turned, his breath caught, and for the first time in years, he froze. What came next didn't just defy logic, it shattered everything he thought was true about life, love, and healing. Because sometimes, the miracle you're praying for doesn't wear a suit, it wears torn clothes, and carries a heart bigger than science can explain. Before you scroll, watch this story until the very end, because what happens in the next few minutes might just change the way you see the world forever. He had everything money could buy, and yet he would have given it all up for one thing: his daughter's smile. The mansion was quiet now, too quiet. No laughter echoed through the halls, no tiny footsteps running down the stairs, no giggles from the playroom, just silence and pain. Thomas Vale was a self-made millionaire. From sleeping in a broken-down car to owning real estate in every major city, he built his empire brick by brick. People saw the private jets, the tailored suits, the luxury, but no one saw the broken man inside. The man who would trade every dollar for a miracle, because his little girl, Ava, couldn't walk anymore. One car crash, one moment of chaos, and suddenly, his whole world was strapped to a wheelchair. Doctors said she'd never walk again, that her spinal damage was permanent, that even the best specialists in the world couldn't reverse what had happened. Thomas didn't cry the day they gave him the news. Not in front of the doctors, not in front of his wife, not even in front of Ava. But when he got into his car that night and closed the door, he screamed until his voice broke, and then he wept like a child. Because what good was money if it couldn't save the one person he loved the most? Every day after that was a silent war. He watched Ava grow quieter, her drawings darker, her eyes emptier. She stopped asking to go outside, stopped laughing at cartoons, stopped smiling when he walked in the room. She was slipping, and he was powerless, until that one strange morning when the beggar boy appeared. It was pouring rain outside. Thomas was leaving a private hospital, carrying yet another folder of hopeless reports. He stepped toward his Rolls Royce when a thin voice called out from behind a rusted bench, "Sir." Thomas turned. A boy, maybe 14, soaked in rags, barefoot, shivering. He wasn't holding out his hand, he wasn't asking for money, he was just staring right into Thomas's eyes. The millionaire paused. He was used to people asking him for favors, handouts, signatures, photos. But this boy, he didn't look desperate, he looked certain. "Sir," the boy said again, taking one step closer, "I can make your daughter walk again." Thomas froze, his breath caught, his hands clenched the folder tighter. "What did you say?" The boy's lips trembled, but his voice didn't. "I said, I can help her walk again." Silence. The rain poured harder. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The boy didn't flinch. "My name is Zayn. I'm not a doctor, not a magician, not a liar. But I've seen something most people don't believe in." Thomas chuckled bitterly, painfully. "You think you know what I've been through. You think some street kid like you can offer me anything." He turned away, furious, but Zayn stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and pulled something from under his coat. It wasn't money. It wasn't a fake miracle cure. It was a photograph. A little girl, her legs twisted, her body in braces. And another photo, the same girl, months later, walking barefoot through a field, smiling, laughing, free. "My sister," Zayn whispered. "They said she'd never walk either, but she does now." Thomas looked down, unsure whether to scream or cry. "Why are you telling me this?" Zayn's eyes didn't blink. "Because I've seen pain. I've seen people give up. And I saw a man today who looked like he was about to give up too." Thomas swallowed hard. The world around him felt like it stopped. "Where is she now?" "She's at the shelter with our mother." "I can take you there." Thomas hesitated. This was insane, irrational, but so was watching your daughter die slowly inside. Every single day, so he nodded and followed the barefoot boy through the rain. They walked through alleys, past abandoned buildings, down streets that smelled like heartbreak, and then there it was. A small shelter with peeling paint, but inside warmth, hope, and in one corner, sitting on a mat, was the same girl from the photo. She was helping another child stand, using her own 2 feet. Thomas stood frozen. Speechless, tears brimmed in his eyes. Zayn's mother came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She didn't bow, didn't flatter. She just looked into Thomas's eyes and said, "I heard about your daughter. I can't promise you a miracle, but I can promise you faith, and a way most doctors forgot exists." Thomas sat, listened, learned, not just about herbal healing, not just about therapy, but about belief, about persistence, about how this woman and her children used pain to unlock power. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something strange stirring in his chest. Hope. He returned home that night with trembling hands. Ava was asleep. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Baby, something's about to change." He didn't know how, didn't know when, but for the first time since that awful night, he didn't feel lost. He felt led, and he had no idea that what came next would shake everything he believed. The next morning, Thomas Vale stood at the edge of his daughter's bed, watching her sleep. Her little fingers were curled gently, her chest rising and falling like soft waves. For the first time in years, he didn't feel helpless. He felt called. He had spent millions searching for solutions. But last night, in a broken shelter with peeling walls, he found something none of that money ever gave him. A whisper of possibility. A boy with no shoes and eyes full of light. A mother who didn't promise miracles. Only belief, and belief somehow felt stronger than medicine now. He gently woke Ava. "Sweetheart," he whispered, kneeling beside her, "I want to take you somewhere." She blinked slowly, unsure. "Another doctor?" He shook his head softly. "No, someone different. Someone who believes in what others don't." Ava didn't respond. She just stared out the window, silent. As usual, Thomas's heart cracked again. But he carried her gently, wrapped her in her favorite blue shawl, and drove not to a hospital, but back through the streets no millionaire ever visits. Back to Zayn. The boy was already waiting near the alley. As if he knew, he opened the shelter gate as Thomas parked nearby. Zayn didn't smile. He simply reached for Ava's hand as Thomas lifted her out of the car. She looked at him, confused, but she didn't pull away. There was something in his touch, calm, respectful, soft. Like he wasn't treating her like she was broken. He treated her like she was brave, and maybe, just maybe, she needed that more than she ever realized. Inside, the room had been cleaned. A mattress now lay in the corner. A bowl of warm water sat beside it. Ava was laid down carefully, and then Zayn's mother stepped forward. She didn't speak grand words. No chants, no promises, just silence, presence, and then she began. She touched Ava's toes, pressed along her legs, watched her reactions. Every movement, every twitch. She studied like a scientist and prayed like a mother. Thomas stood by the wall, fists clenched, hope raging inside him like a storm. Days passed, then a week. Every morning he brought Ava, and every evening they left with more than they came with. Not miracles, but moments where Ava flinched, moments where her fingers twitched, moments where she looked into Zayn's eyes and smiled for the first time in months. One day, as Thomas waited outside the shelter, Zayn sat next to him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Do you know what I prayed for when my sister was sick?" Thomas turned to him, curious. "I didn't pray that she would walk again." Zayn said, "I prayed she wouldn't stop dreaming. Because when dreams die, healing becomes harder." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. That was the difference. The world had tried to fix Ava's legs, but no one had tried to reach her heart. Back at the mansion, Thomas's wife Elena had doubts. "You're risking her hope again," she warned. "She's been let down so many times." "I know," Thomas said, "but this feels different." But doubt has a way of growing, and one morning everything almost fell apart. Ava had woken up screaming. Her legs were cramping. The pain was unbearable. Thomas rushed her to the hospital, terrified. The doctors ran tests, shook their heads. It's neurological, they said. She shouldn't be feeling pain in her legs if she's paralyzed. Thomas's heart skipped. What does that mean? The doctor looked baffled. It means something's changing, but we don't know what. He didn't wait for more answers. He drove back to the shelter, stormed in. Zayn stood still as Thomas marched toward him. What's happening to her? Zayn didn't back away. He looked up calmly and said, her body is remembering. Pain is the first step before sensation. You should be happy, sir, not scared. But Thomas wasn't happy. He was terrified because hope was dangerous. He sat outside the shelter that night alone, head in his hands. Tears slipped down his cheeks. I don't know what I'm doing, he whispered, and then a soft voice answered, none of us do. At first, it was Zayn's mother. She sat beside him, hands folded. You've lived your whole life thinking money solves everything, but your daughter doesn't need a billionaire. She needs a believer. Thomas looked at her, eyes burning. But what if I fail her again? She smiled gently. Then you stand back up and try again. That night, Thomas returned home and sat beside Ava. She was asleep again, but there was something different. Her hands were resting peacefully. No tremble, no tension, just peace. And in that moment, he didn't feel rich. He didn't feel helpless. He felt human, a father, a man fighting not with power, but with love. And maybe that was enough. What he didn't know was that the biggest test was yet to come. Because sometimes when light enters a broken soul, the darkness fights back harder. And just as Ava began to hope again, the world would try to break them one last time, but this time, they weren't alone. They had Zayn, they had each other, and most importantly, they had begun to believe again. The morning light filtered softly through the shelter window. Zayn stood barefoot on the cold cement floor, gently holding Ava's hand as she tried, once again, to move her legs. Her eyes were focused, her jaw tight, her body shaking, but something inside her had changed. This wasn't the same girl who once refused to smile. This was someone who wanted to fight, who was trying, for herself, for her father, for the belief that had begun to grow in her soul like a flame. And then suddenly, her toe moved, just a twitch, but enough to make Zayn's eyes widen, enough to send his mother covering her mouth in stunned silence, enough to make Thomas, who stood in the doorway, drop the cup of tea in his hand. Because it was real, it was happening, the miracle had begun, but just as the sky starts to brighten, a storm often brews on the horizon. That evening, a government vehicle pulled up outside the shelter. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions hard, their presence cold. Zayn's mother stepped forward, confused. They handed her a notice. The building was scheduled for demolition. A commercial developer had purchased the land. They had 7 days to vacate. Thomas arrived minutes later and saw the commotion. He grabbed the notice, read it, and felt rage boil in his chest. 7 days to tear down the place that gave him back his hope? He stormed into his office the next day, demanding answers, only to find that he himself owned the company that had signed off on the demolition. It was a leftover deal from months ago, one of many properties his assistants managed. He had forgotten all about it, and now his own hand was threatening the very shelter that was saving his daughter's life. Thomas sat down, silent, shaken. His empire had been built on taking, buying, owning, but now, for the first time, it was time to give. He returned to the shelter that night, this time not in a suit, not in a luxury car. He came quietly, humbly, like a man who finally saw what mattered. He gathered everyone inside. Ava sat beside Zayn, their hands still interlocked. Thomas looked around the room, broken walls, flickering lights, a worn-out floor, and yet it was the most sacred place he had ever stood in. Then he spoke. I signed the papers that were going to destroy this place. I didn't know, I didn't see, but I see now. He turned to Zayn's mother, to you. I owe more than I can ever repay. You didn't just treat my daughter, you reminded me who I was before I had money. He looked at Zayn, and you, young man, you gave me something no doctor ever could. Faith. I'm not going to let this place disappear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. I've transferred full ownership of the land to you and your mother. You will never be asked to leave again. Tears welled in Zayn's mother's eyes. She placed her hand on her chest and whispered, "Thank you, but we didn't do this for land." Thomas nodded, "I know. And that's why you deserve it more than anyone else." But the miracle wasn't complete yet. There was one more moment left, one more day. Ava had grown stronger over the last weeks. Her muscles responding, her soul glowing, but she still hadn't stood, not fully, and no one wanted to force it. Until that one afternoon, the sky outside was golden, soft wind blowing through the open windows. Ava looked up at Zayn and said softly, "Do you think I can try now?" Zayn's eyes filled instantly. "Yes," he said, "I think you already know how." She placed her small hand on his shoulder, and slowly, ever so slowly, she pushed herself up. Thomas stood frozen, unable to breathe. His wife, standing behind him, gripped his arm tightly. And then her knees lifted, her legs straightened, and for the first time since the accident, Ava stood, wobbly, shaking, but she stood, and in that single, sacred second time collapsed. Tears fell like rivers. Zayn fell to his knees, sobbing. Thomas collapsed beside him, his arms outstretched, shaking with gratitude. Elena wept uncontrollably, whispering her daughter's name again and again, and Ava, she smiled. Not a small one, a full, glowing, radiant smile, the kind she hadn't shown since the accident, and then she took a step, one, then another and another, right into her father's arms. He caught her mid-step, crying into her shoulder, holding her like a lifeline. Everything he'd ever wanted, right there, in his arms, walking, alive. The news spread like fire. But Thomas didn't call the press. He didn't post about it. He didn't need headlines, because this wasn't for fame. This was for healing, for redemption. He donated the shelter enough funding to run for the next 20 years. He opened a center next to it named the Ava Foundation for Hope and Healing. Zayn became its youngest instructor. And Ava, she became its first student, and its first miracle. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the moment his life changed, he didn't mention a business deal, or a $1 million contract, or a luxury car. He said, "It was the day a barefoot boy in the rain looked me in the eye and gave me back my daughter." Some stories aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to awaken something inside us. This wasn't just about a little girl who walked again. It was about a man who learned how to feel again, about a boy the world ignored, who became the light someone else was waiting for, about a shelter the city forgot. That became the home where miracles were reborn. You see, sometimes the greatest healers come from the humblest places, and the most broken people carry the greatest power to restore others. Thomas Vale built towers that touched the sky, but none of them mattered until he touched the ground where Zayn stood. He had been looking for answers in the wrong places, in polished buildings and expensive treatments, when what he needed was standing barefoot in the rain with a heart full of belief. Ava's healing didn't begin with therapy. It began the moment someone believed she could still be whole, that her spirit wasn't paralyzed, only waiting to be seen. And Zayn, he didn't need a degree. He didn't need riches. He just needed someone to listen. To see that what he carried, though wrapped in poverty, was sacred. It was love. It was faith. It was the kind of courage the world doesn't teach, but life reveals when there's nothing left to lose. And now, years later, when people visit the Ava Foundation, they don't just come for treatment. They come to remember what humanity looks like. They walk through its halls and see a framed photo at the entrance, a little girl walking hand in hand with a barefoot boy. No fancy words beneath it, just a single line engraved on gold. One believed she could walk, the other believed she could fly. That's the power of faith, of second chances, of listening when the world tells you to look away. And if you're watching this now, wondering whether your brokenness can ever become beauty, wondering if the pieces of your life could ever be part of something whole again, let Ava remind you, let Zayn remind you. Let this story echo in your chest. You are never too broken to rise. You are never too small to change someone's life, and sometimes, the miracle you're waiting for is standing right in front of you. Barefoot, unnoticed, but sent for you, so keep believing, keep reaching, because one day when you least expect it, you might turn around and find a beggar boy whispering something that changes everything.